Welcome back to FreightWaves Now on this Friday morning. We're welcoming our managing editor here at FreightWaves, Rachel Premak, to the show. Rachel sat down with an energy executive recently to talk a little bit about decarbonization processes. Rachel, thank you for joining us, and talk to us a little bit about who you spoke with and what they're saying about the overall state of decarbonization.
Yeah, so I spoke to Melissa Williams at Shell Marine. She's based in Houston. She's worked at Shell for many years. And one big initiative at Shell, and I imagine most fuel companies right now, is to look at alternative ways to either reduce how much fuel a ship uses or even look at alternative fuel sources. And it's a complicated issue because these ships, they mostly run on this really thick tar-like fuel called marine fuel oil, and it's really hard to move away from that. So it's definitely a complicated industry to try to decarbonize, but there's a lot of need for it for sure.
Rachel, definitely sounds like there's a lot of variables that go into this. Do you have any idea, or were there any talks of a potential timeline on the shift as we start to look to this decarbonization or a change in this industry?
Yeah, it's definitely decades and decades away. Looking at the ships themselves, they last for 20, 30, 40 years. So one potential way to move away from the marine fuel oil is to run ships instead on liquefied natural gas or LNG. The problem is that you need to build a whole new ship for that. So the ships we're building now, those could use LNG, but we still have so many vessels that are running on the traditional types of fuel. The other way of looking at this is also running ships on biofuels, but that's, again, something you need to build a whole new ship for. So it's decades away for sure.
I think that's something that's really interesting when we talk about decarbonization is kind of this broader conversation about just how entrenched on reliance on petroleum products kind of the human race is as a whole, right? Not only just in powering your ships or powering your trucks or powering your equipment, but it's also in the plastic products that you make to go on your trucks. And it's also in the power that you have for the machinery to make these kinds of things. And so decarbonization isn't just about how we're running, it's about how we're taking those steps to change what we're putting into it as well. Where does that conversation kind of land in the scope of folks' goals for decarbonization? Or is that just a goal that is way too far out for people to even think about right now?
Yeah, it's taking a kind of a different look at that. There's definitely one big, issue when you bring up, okay, let's stop using this marine fuel oil, is that, okay, but this oil comes from the entire refining process. So if ships aren't using that fuel, it's just, where does that go? So it's definitely a larger ecosystem of what to do with this fuel that is, a byproduct of the refining process. So it's definitely a larger ecosystem, but trying to explore which parts of this to take apart, it's definitely a really challenging task, and it's something that Miss Williams, when I spoke with her, she mentioned this whole thing of where we need a whole ecosystem involved. We need the customers of Shell Marine and the customers' customers and universities and governments and international organizations. It's a whole process. It's a whole community, I guess you could say, that has to be involved in this.
And Rachel, when you're looking at this, one of the things you mentioned, of course, earlier, that this is going to be like a decades-long process. When you look into, of course, the scope of just being a business, where does financials kind of start to fit in this? Do you see this as a potential headwind as trying to make that transition, or something that really can be pushed aside and really be seen as not too much of a headwind, but really just an ongoing project over the next few years?
Yeah, definitely. So one, short-term solution to this is actually the use of lubricants in your ships. You can use these sorts of fancy lubricant systems to reduce how much fuel your ship is using. And that, obviously that's great for the environment. That's great for your bottom line because you're using less fuel. Fuel is very costly, especially nowadays. So that's one side of things. The other side is that it is definitely a financial a financial issue when you look at the shipping industry as a whole. They aren't as profitable, or they do definitely run on low margins, not in the last few years, but generally speaking, it is a low margin industry. So trying to figure out how to best fund this transition, given the fact that margins can be very low, that's definitely yet another challenge in decarbonizing the entire industry. But I think the fact that the IMO has been so involved in setting these regulations, I think that is definitely a good step forward in at least directing these companies into a more of a decarbonized type of environment.
I think when we talk about kind of the broad scale reputation of fuel companies like this, like Shell, like Valero, like Exxon, they kind of get a bad rap, right? Especially from the general public. People see them and they think, okay, they're just money hungry, environmental destroyers, right? But it's conversations like this one that you are having where it really sheds light that they're invested in goals to make a better environment overall. So Rachel, can you tell me a little bit about how important it is to have these conversations and to bring them to the public, to get everybody to know that it's not just a problem that the fuel industry is ignoring, that they are actually taking steps to try and combat this problem?
Yeah, it's something that definitely I'm a little skeptical of at first as well. Of course, Shell wants to say that they're doing these sort of like PR-friendly, environmental type things. But this is like the direction where everything is headed. We saw in the last few months, obviously, that we can't just switch to electric, switch to biofuels tomorrow, because we are still very highly dependent on fossil fuels. But I think it is good to at least have the conversation, start exploring that, and in the short term, obviously, companies like Shell are going to be heavily profiting off of fossil fuels and these sorts of fuels that are not particularly great for the environment. But it is a process. It is, like we've been talking about, it is a decades-long process, and I think it's good that they are at least taking that first step and really exploring different ways to make this happen.
Rachel, of course, we're here talking about the conversation that you had with this executive, but shifting gears here, but sticking to the energy sector, you put out an article not too long ago in collaboration with John Kingston regarding diesel prices. I love the article, and I've been pointing to it through a lot of my audiences on Freightonomics and Economy Lately. Real quick, can you highlight some of those points there?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all. The big kind of overarching point that I think John Kingston was making is just this idea that we have such low inventories of fuel right now. And even though prices have been declining for the past 6 to 7 weeks, I forget the exact number, but right now fuel prices have been declining, but the fact is that inventory is still really low, and we have all these other sorts of trends starting to arise that will probably even draw further on that supply of fuel. You have a brewing, natural gas crisis in Europe, where diesel would be used in lieu of Russian fuels in Europe. You have harvest season coming up. You have these scheduled turnarounds and maintenance at various refineries. It's just like there's a whole bunch of things coming on the horizon that will probably push up the price of diesel again, unfortunately, for drivers of truck drivers and other folks in the industrial economy.
It's definitely something that we're going to be watching. Rachel, thank you for joining us. Of course, you can find her content up on FreightWaves.com. We're going to take another quick break, and then we'll be right back to get more FreightWaves Now.